The drone army of the armed forces of Ukraine completely changed the fate of the war on all front lines from Crimea to Luhansk. Ukraine's UAVs have undertaken successful attack missions that will go down in history. Over time, the rules of the game changed and the war reached the Russian lands. Yes, the fire that the Ukrainians started for the sake of independence finally managed to cross the borders of Russia. Undoubtedly, the UAVs were the main actors in this success. Ukraine has repeatedly targeted critical border cities such as Russia's Belgorod with the drones they use. After each attack, an atmosphere of panic grows in Russia, and as Russian citizens tried to recover from the socio-psychological effects of the war, Ukraine's drone attacks dragged them into an even more intractable depression. The dangerous fire brought by the environment of chaos that started in Belgorod slowly began to envelop other cities of Russia. Ukraine had enough of a drone army to worry the Russians. Therefore, with the exception of Belgorod, Russian cities at much great distances could easily be targeted by Ukrainian drones. The other day, one of the most interesting attacks on the subject struck Russia again. The target of the Ukrainian drone army this time was the Russian city of Krasnodar. An explosion occurred in an oil depot in the Krasnodar territory, and a huge fire broke out shortly after this explosion. The source of the explosion that initially caused the fire was unclear, but the cause of the explosion was revealed as a result of the first researches. The source of this stunning explosion was, again, a drone attack. As a result of this drone attack, the infrastructure of the oil depot belonging to the Rosneft company was badly damaged. The exact number of drones involved in the attack on the oil depot was not disclosed. However, judging by the photos shared by the locals on social media, it seemed highly likely that a large number of drones were used due to the severity and effects of the attack on the oil storage base. The city of Krasnodar in the Russian Federation is at least 470 kilometers away from the Ukrainian front lines. The city is a critical region between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, connecting Crimea and Russia. With such attacks, Ukraine may be aiming to cut the logistics connection or supply lines between the Crimea and the Russian army. In photographs taken by Krasnodar residents, it turned out that the fire that started after the explosion was quite strong. Its consequences could not be eliminated for quite some time, and fire and a huge pillar of smoke could be observed from a distance of several kilometers. It was not specified what type of drones were used in the attack, but parts of the drones carrying large quantities of plastic explosives were found on the territory of Belgorod a few hours before the attack. The fact that there was a similar attack in the city of Belgorod, which is constantly targeted by Ukrainian drones, brought to mind that Kiev planned the unexplained attack in Krasnodar. As a result, the extent of the damage to the Rosneft oil depot has not yet been specified. However, the most important detail of the attack was that the UAVs had reached the Krasnodar territory, and this issue was considered as a very serious concern in Russia. The effective range of the Soviet Aerojet-powered drones of the Ukrainian forces up to 800 kilometers raised question marks in minds. Russia's concerns on this issue might actually be justified because drones, which have an effective range of 800 kilometers, can reach much farther than this distance, and they don't actually need to travel that far. The reason for this is that the distance between Krasnodar and Berdyansk is about 540 kilometers. In other words, even if the Ukrainians began these attacks from Berdyansk, they can easily reach the Russian city of Krasnodar with their drone army. Therefore, it is not impossible for Krasnodar to be targeted by Ukrainians. There is, however, another view regarding the source of the attack. It is also possible that the libertarian anti-war Russian citizens within the borders of Russia may have carried out these attacks. Even if one of the two possibilities is true, These attacks are of great importance to show the Russians a truth. If the attacks targeting the oil refinery in Krasnodar were carried out by Russian citizens who are against the war, it means that even the Russians do not want this war to continue. If we consider the other possibility, that is, if the Ukrainian forces carried out these attacks from Berdyansk or any Ukrainian city within range to carry out the attack, the situation is still bad for the Russians because this time Ukraine would carry the war to a completely different dimension and would have focused on cross-border airstrikes. And the effects of the war would be felt in Russia more intensely with each passing day. On the other hand, after the attacks in Krasnodar city, unexplained mysterious situations began to occur at the Russian air base in Yeysk. A total of 6 Russian fighter bombers were lost after the fire and the drone attack on the Russian air base in the city of Yeysk. The disappearance of the Russian warplanes took place after the fire, which locals observed near Russian airspace. In the news that appeared earlier on the subject, the Ukrainian service had pointed out that the last images of the surrounding area were burned fields. The burnt areas are located on the territory of the 720-26th Air Defense Training Center of the Russian Air Force next to the airfield. The fire at that place may have been caused by the crash of a Ukrainian drone again. All these attacks actually showed that Ukraine had almost reached a remarkable level in carrying the water Russia, because as we mentioned in the video, there was a revival in Belgorod, one of the cities most targeted by the Ukrainian UAV army. The mayor of Belgorod, Valentin Demidov, announced in a statement he shared recently that the wreckage of 3 drones was found in Belgorod, Russia, but no injuries were reported. Meanwhile, one of the regional governors, Andrei Vorobyev, stated that a drone crashed near the village of Gorbatov in the Moscow region, about 400 miles from the Ukrainian border. Vorobyev reported that the UAV was located next to the Voskresensk gas compressor station, which belongs to Russia's energy giant Gazprom. The governors of the Kursk and Belgorod regions on the border with Ukraine have repeatedly accused the Ukrainian armed forces of bombing the border. However, Mikhailo Podolyak, one of President Volodymyr Zelensky's advisors, denied that Ukraine was carrying out attacks on Russian soil, emphasizing that Kyiv was waging a defensive war to save all its lands from occupation and that this was an axiom. Russian Federation official state news agency TASS reported that Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was asked to deny that Podolyak had carried out attacks on Ukrainian targets on Russian territory. The Kremlin leader told reporters that the Ukrainian official statements were not credible. On the other hand, the increase in panic and fragmentation in Russia was clearly observed as a reflection of the increase in domestic attacks on infrastructure facilities by unidentified UAVs. Although the Ukrainian side did not accept responsibility for the attacks, huge problems seemed to be imminent for the Russians. The statements of the official pointed out that such incidents would not come to an end in Russia as the Ukrainians lost their advantage in the territory of Ukraine. They could not find a solution to the striking explosions, fires, and drone attacks that took place within their own country's borders. In addition, in the Crimean Peninsula annexed by Russia, unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to the Ukrainian forces were constantly seen in the peninsula skies. In fact, Russia was in a much more advanced position in the air defense and offensive areas than the Ukrainian army in the first days of the war. The Russian army had attack planes, helicopters, and many other military vehicles, but the Ukrainians managed to take this military power from the Russians thanks to the ingenious strategy they have applied since the beginning of the war and the right cards that they have chosen. And if you're aware, there were serious gaps between Russia and Ukraine in terms of the number of soldiers, but the Ukrainians were able to close such gaps, as we mentioned, with unbelievable methods. In this way, the Ukrainians were able to recapture dozens of their cities from the Russians. All this data and the details of the war showed us that a war cannot be won only on paper. On top of all this, it takes determination, faith, and the fire of freedom to win a war. Let's see who and where the fire of freedom in Ukraine will burn in the coming days. The security of the West and the Eastern European bloc, especially the EU and the USA, is directly related to the security of both the Middle East and Central Asia. And now the Black Sea is at the heart of this relation. Dozens of Russian warships and battle boats have so far been destroyed by the Ukrainian navy and artillery in the waters of the Black Sea and on the Ukrainian river Dnipro. The interesting part was the artillery's ability to destroy Russian boats. This is a rare occurrence, but in Dnipro this has now become normal, and in the last few weeks, nearly a dozen Russian assault boats have been sunk by artillery. Let's examine the critical events in and around the Black Sea and how the Russian attack boats were sunk, with the latest striking details. The Black Sea is not just a geographical area or a basin that can be handled with a focus on economy and security. It is also important how the perceptions about the Black Sea are shaped on a regional and country basis and what it means for different actors. For Russia, the Black Sea contains many arguments to be discussed in terms of gas supply lines passing through here being of critical importance in terms of trade routes and ensuring the security of the country. With the disintegration of the Soviet Union, most of the countries bordering the Black Sea came out of Russian influence and became closer to the West and became members of NATO and the European Union. The Black Sea has become one of the geographies where the rivalry between the East and the West is seen most clearly. The increasing influence of the West in the Black Sea causes Western states to be more interested in this geography. On the other hand, Russia is trying to reduce the influence of Western alliances, especially NATO in the Black Sea. Georgia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Ukraine, which have coasts on the Black Sea, do not have any other sea exits other than the Black Sea. These countries are extremely sensitive to developments in the Black Sea because most of the energy and goods flow is provided through the Black Sea. The Black Sea is also of great importance for Turkey's security. For example, Crimea is only 278 kilometers from the Anatolian coastline, considering Turkey's northern tip as Ukraine and its southern tip of Syria. The critical importance of the Black Sea for Turkey can be understood more clearly, especially in this critical naval area where it is claimed that Russia's Su-27 fighter jet and the US MQ-9 Reaper unmanned aerial vehicle collide nowadays. The Ukrainian armed forces have started to take serious steps to increase their dominance in recent days. The most critical area in these stormy waters is the Crimean Peninsula, the key strategic center of the Ukrainian-Russian war. In order to recapture the peninsula, Ukrainian forces have carried out serious offensive operations both in the Kherson region and in the Dnipro River region, especially these days. The past day, the Ukrainian defense forces in the southern regions of Ukraine eliminated 15 invaders and destroyed a Grad multiple rocket launch system on Kinburn Island. Following this attack on the left bank of the Dnipro River, Ukrainian forces also eliminated the missile launcher of an S-300 anti-aircraft system, with the Ukrainian forces besieging Dnipro. The Russians began to look for exit routes in the river with their attack boats, but the striking operations of the Ukrainian armed forces continued at full speed. The Ukrainian forces destroyed a Russian ammunition depot, 2 reconnaissance UAVs, 2 motorboats intended for use by the Russian military forces, an artillery radar system, and several military trucks, in an offensive along the line, stretching from the Novokharkovka region to Dnipro. The destruction of 2 Russian attack boats in this offensive operation limited the reconnaissance and sabotage activities of the Russians in Dnipro. In addition, Ukrainian forces continued to advance along this front line without stopping after this attack in the direction of Tavria. The Ukrainian Defense Forces succeeded in sinking another Russian boat near Belgorod Island in Dnipro. The Russian motorboats in the river were being destroyed one by the Ukrainian forces until the end of these attacks. Russian troops had lost 3 boats in total within 2 days. According to the latest data, these boats were out of the game as a result of the successful firing of the Ukrainian artillery unit. On the other hand, the Ukrainian forces who managed to take Dnipro into their hand destroyed 5 Russian attack boats carrying Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups in the week before their attacks near Tavria. Again, with the shootings of the Ukrainian artillery and the sinking of the Russian boats carrying out a reconnaissance and detection mission in Dnipro, the invading forces had to protect the areas they were in the Dnipro River region. Therefore, the Russians began to maintain only a defensive position in this region. These operations, which turned Dnipro into a ring of fire, took place in just 2 weeks. In summary, the Ukrainian armed forces blew up a total of 3 Russian assault boats in just 48 hours and the total of 8 attack boats in 2 weeks. At present, the chances of the Russians launching a counterattack on the Dnipro River are considered very low. On the other hand, the dominance of Ukrainian forces in and around Kherson continues. In fact, all these attacks are steps that lead to success in the plans of the Ukrainian armed forces to seize the Crimean Peninsula. Ukraine's taking control of both the Dnipro and Kherson regions is important in terms of retargeting Crimea. The fact that the tension in Kherson and Dnipro has reached such a high level also worries the Russian forces and residents of the region who are normally on the peninsula. The residents of Crimea are quite justified in these concerns. The reason for this is the possible major offensive of the Ukrainian forces targeting the Crimean Peninsula, which is seen as the Pearl of the Black Sea. The road to victory for Ukraine passes through the Crimea. Therefore, the liberation of Crimea this year could change everything in this war. So the focus of Kiev's allies should be primarily helping Ukraine liberate Crimea. This should be the main effort when using force saving in the east to slow or stop Russia's ground attacks. Ukraine knows it will never be safe as long as Russian forces occupy the peninsula. Any peace treaty that really results in Russia holding these lands allows the Kremlin to wait 2 or 3 years until the West loses interest. During this time, the Russians rebuild their army, correct their mistakes, and restart their war against Ukraine. After all, Russia has been using this tactic as a model since about 2008. To liberate Crimea means first to make the peninsula untenable for the Russian army, navy, and air force, and then to occupy it. It should start with isolating the omni-terrestrial communication line, connecting the peninsula to Russia using long-range precision strikes. The Kerch Bridge, already badly damaged by Ukrainian forces, and the so-called land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia via Mariupol and Melitopol all along the coastline of the Sea of Azov should be one of the first targets. Targeting this transport infrastructure will initiate the isolation of Crimea from supply or movement. It is highly likely that the possible operation of the striking Crimean plan of Ukraine will be, as we mentioned, because other alternatives are quite risky. For this reason, Ukrainians should first take control of the Kerch Bridge, which is the connecting bridge to Crimea and other strategic centers to the peninsula. On the other hand, the Russian army has the superior will to win this critical Crimean process. Ukrainians defend their homeland and are supported by a coalition of 50 nations. Russia, on the other hand, only has allies such as Iran and North Korea. Russian soldiers do not particularly want to be in the Crimean Peninsula, and the Russian people who are happy enough to wave a flag do not want to join the army. You may recall that about 500,000 Russian men of military age had left the country to avoid partial mobilization. Meanwhile, despite the low stockpiles of ammunition, Ukraine's logistics are steadily improving, thanks to the support of the coalition. Russia's logistics, on the other hand, are getting worse and worse, thanks to sanctions, weak and corrupt governance over consumption, and precision strikes by Ukraine's precision weapons. In other words, the Russian army fell far behind the Ukrainian forces, both in terms of soldiers to fight at the front and in ammunition supply. Russia currently has 97% of its army in Ukraine, and yet they cannot even capture the small town of Bakhmut in the east of Ukraine, defended mainly by regional defense forces and National Guard units of the Ukrainian armed forces. It seems very difficult for the Russians, who could not capture the small city, to hold a peninsula like Crimea, which is strategic and open to attack from every angle. Ukrainians conducted a massive drone strike on Moscow. The target of the strike became the military base of an engineer battalion that is located in the southwestern suburbs. However, this particular military base was not chosen because it has a significant influence on the course of the war. This base was rather chosen because of its proximity to Moscow. This was a direct response to the recent massive drone strikes on Kiev. As you remember, over the last several days, Russians were attacking it with dozens of Shahed kamikaze drones. Local residents released dozens of videos, and Russian military analysts quickly created a list of locations where the drones were spotted and reported that Ukrainians attacked Moscow with at least 32 drones, which is approximately the same number as Russians used yesterday. Local residents also posted the result of air defense work. Some of them received critique, but because the Russian Ministry of Defense placed air defense next to a highway, it was obvious that thousands of cars would film it with their cameras. The Russian Ministry of Defense quickly released the report and claimed that there are only 8 drones and that all of them were destroyed. This statement was not well received because there were multiple videos showing that plenty of drones reached their destination. The Russian defense minister said that 3 out of 8 drones were shot down with air defense systems, while 5 drones were neutralized by the electronic warfare systems, which basically hijacks the GPS system of the drone and sends the drone in the opposite direction of the target. For this reason, there are multiple videos that show how drones hit the residential areas around the military base. The president of the Russian Federation made a statement and said that Ukrainians conducted a terrorist attack against civilians as retribution for the successful Russian strike on Kiev. Referring to the results published by the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that yesterday they conducted a successful precision strike and eliminated 1 more Patriot system and blew up the main center of Ukrainian intelligence. The defense minister, Shoigu, also claimed that over the last month they have shut down almost 200 HIMARS rockets and 30 Storm Shadow missiles. However, it turned out that the Russian public did not care about the strike too much anyways. Many of the civilians even cheered it. The reason why they had such a contradictory reaction is that the military side that Ukrainians targeted was located around 1 kilometer away from Rubliovka. Rubliovka is the most prestigious area in entire Russia, where all the wealthiest people, the so-called Russian elite, live. So most of the houses that were damaged by the drones that the Russian electronic warfare system directed away from the base belonged to the Russian elite. A famous Russian dancer made a video complaining about the explosions in her region, which sparked this wave of positive reactions. The positive reaction to this so-called bombing of Rubliovka became a serious issue that was even raised by the state media. One of the most prominent Russian news hosts said that this reaction is unacceptable because people who live in Rubliovka are also Russians and laugh in it. It should be considered treason when it comes to the results of the strike so far. The explosions on the military base were recorded and reported only by the local residents, and there is no information on whether any objects on the base were damaged or destroyed from confirmed information. There was an explosion in an alcohol factory somewhere near the military base, which was highly likely caused by a drone strike. Apart from the military objectives, the strike also demonstrated that the general population does not associate itself with the elite that rules the country. This also explains why Russia is struggling to implement drastic measures to ramp up its offensive effort. The social discontent is extremely high, and compelling the population to radically change their lives through general mobilization or wide industrial mobilization threatens the stability of the regime that the population barely tolerates.